here's what's what. A question that's currently appearing throughout the image boards and Twitter is this rhetorical, what is white? Usually posed as a sort of rebuttal to an identitarian. So, the idea behind this question is to probe how far the identitarian will budge along the racial spectrum. Are Italians white? How about Russians? What about people from the northwestern Middle East? Are some Iranians white? And the answer is usually some form of cutoff point, or, oh, if they're not in Europe, or even worse, some anecdotal, oh, if they're white, you know they're white. And this completely misses the point of the question. So let's take it apart and examine it. What is white? In the context of this question, white is the relevant collective that shares enough traits, in contrast with other collectives, to warrant cooperating with in order to perpetuate them. The context of the inquiry is the discussion of a collective, in this case, whites. The overall implication behind it is, how far are you willing to stretch the adherence criteria of this collective? And in order to unpack this, we need to look at the premises we're operating on. The central elements to the question are, first of all, that race exists. Whether it ultimately does or doesn't is peripheral to the question. We're assuming it does for the purposes of the intellectual exercise. And second of all, that racial characteristics are unique enough to be collectivized upon. Perhaps they are, perhaps they aren't, but the nature of the question implies that there is enough variety amongst races to be able to say, this is one race, this is another. But the ultimate question we need to ask is, why are we asking this? In the last episode, we discussed the importance of trait perpetuation, so let's apply that thinking here. If one's goal is to perpetuate their traits, then they have a number of ways to go about doing so. One of these strategies is to work with others who share those traits to a greater or lesser degree. For example, people from one geographic area will work together to compete with outsiders for resources, forming a collective, an in-group. Remember, as we discussed before, all resources are finite, and all resources distill into time, the ultimate resource. What this means is that the in-group that is successful at competing for resources will be able to sustain themselves longer and to procreate at a greater capacity. They will exist longer. Their traits will exist longer. They will have had fulfilled the ultimate existential goal, perpetuation of traits. This is basic evolution, and of course common sense, but the implications are profound. Because racial collectives can be thought of in much the same way. If one's goal is to perpetuate their traits, it is beneficial to work with those who share them. However, this is entirely dependent on the context of the environment. A frame of reference is required to determine whether or not something belongs to a collective. If we have, for example, a bag of apples, let's say they're red and green, we can collectivize the two types of apples. We have red apples and we have green apples. We could also collectivize them all as one group, apples, but at that point the distinction has no practical purpose. Everything belongs to it. However, if we have a bag of all sorts of different fruits, apples, oranges, bananas, we can start to create different scales of collectives. The red apples or the green apples still exist as collectives, but in contrast to the oranges, we can collectivize the apples overall as a group. And this now is a useful collective, since there's all sorts of other fruits in the bag we can now distinguish from. In relevance to our initial question, we can think of racial collectives in much the same way. Within the context of the environment, relevant collectives change. Within Europe, Western and Eastern Europeans are significantly different groups, and within the frame of reference of just Europeans, they are two very distinct collectives. If, however, the frame of reference is zoomed in, Western Europeans can be collectively subdivided further, into Germans and Brits and so forth. When the frame of reference is zoomed out, Europeans overall are one collective, in contrast to Africans or Asians, for example. If we consider all life on Earth overall, humans becomes a relevant collective, in contrast to all the other forms of life. So, how does this answer our question, what is white? Well, if we begin on the premise that one's goal is to perpetuate their traits, then it logically follows that it is beneficial to work with those who share them. Those who share them is a collective that is subjective to the frame of reference, which in this case is all of humanity. So, what is white? Well, in the context of this question, white is the relevant collective that shares enough traits, in contrast with other collectives, to warrant cooperating with in order to perpetuate them. That's that. If you have thoughts about my content, let me know in the comments. Also follow me on Twitter at Arbiter of Truth.